Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests. My name is Richard Fijo, and I'm a Larrakia man of direct male descent of the Larrakia through my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather in what Aboriginal culture calls grandfather law. We, the Larrakia people, are known as saltwater people, although our land boundaries extend approximately 50 kilometres inland. We've always been a welcoming people, and we've always been a community-minded people. We want what's best for everyone. No matter who you are or where you come from, when you're on our land, you become a part of our story. And this welcoming feeling defines who we are as Larrakia people. Something I wanted to share with you this morning is that something my mother used to say to us growing up: education is knowledge and knowledge is power. And truth has its place in this storytelling. And they also say truth shall set us free. So truth has its place in us becoming one community, irrelevant of where we come from. But I hope this helps define us all as Australians. You have come by way of Larrakia land. You'll hear the voices of our ancestors. When you leave, you'll take the Larrakia message with you. Reverend W. Fijo. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honour to welcome each and every one of you to Larrakia land this morning. May our ancestors guide and protect you always. Thank you.
And now, before we move on, I would like to, on behalf of my colleagues and the College of Aboriginal Futures, Arts and Society, I would like to introduce and welcome to the seminar Professor Thalia Anthony of the University of Technology in Sydney to our seminar today. Professor Anthony will facilitate the question and answer session at the end of Professor Dodson's presentation. Thank you. I'll hand over to Thalia.
Ajari, Gamawara, everyone. I'm on Gadigal land. I'm really excited to be here today for this seminar. I feel that we're going to learn a lot and also hopefully shape the direction of treaties in the Northern Territory and across Australia. I'd really encourage everyone to upload their questions as Mick Dodson is speaking, and then we will address them after his speech, and of course upload further questions in the Q&A session as well. So please feel free to share your thoughts, and we'll be responding afterwards, and enjoy this exciting seminar.
Thank you so much, Thalia. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome today's guest speaker to the seminar series, Professor Mick Dodson, one of Australia's most eminent Indigenous academics. And Professor Mick Dodson is the Treaty Commissioner for the Northern Territory. And I would like to welcome him to the stage to give his presentation. Thank you.
Naji Gurjan. Hello everyone. Nayu Nilawal Michael Jallery Janaburu Rubivi. My name is Michael Jallery and I'm from Broome. My first duty, of course, is to acknowledge the Larrakia people on whose ancestral lands we meet, and also to thank Richard for his warm welcome to country. And greetings to others who aren't on Larrakia country. I want to extend my greetings to the traditional owners in all of those places where you might presently be. And hello, Thalia, and it's good to see you again. My understanding of this seminar series is that it's about James Cook and truth-telling. And both are subjects that we've, from time to time, hotly contested in debates about Australian history. And in chronological and historical terms, James Cook precedes truth-telling. So I think I'll begin with him and look at that aspect of our shared history. When I was in primary school at Katherine, where I was born, I was told by my teachers who were all white and mainly educated in Adelaide, that someone called Captain Cook had discovered Australia and we should be grateful for that and live happily ever after. I'm not sure if the experience at Katherine Primary engendered in me a love of history, but I became, and I'm still, fascinated with history. Australian history was compulsory in every year except year 12 at boarding school in Victoria, where I got my secondary education. And I studied Australian history at university and aspects of American and Russian history as well. British constitutional history was a compulsory subject in those days at Monash University, where I did my law degree. It's an interesting subject, really, British constitutional history, considering that it doesn't have a written history like we do here in Oz. Now, I mentioned these experiences because truth-telling is so inextricably interwoven with history. And that's where I would like to now turn. And I've called this part of my presentation Before and After James Cook. Let me at first talk about those white fellas who explored what the world now knows as Australia, those white fellas before Lieutenant Cook. And there's some evidence to suggest that the Chinese may have been here for up to 300 years before any European. And my understanding that debate is still festering amongst historians of Australia. Dutch explorers in 1606 made the first recorded European sightings and the first recorded landfalls of the Australian mainland. The first ship and crew to chart the Australian coast and meet with Aboriginal people was the Dodson, captained by Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon. He sighted the coast of Cape York Peninsula in early 1606, 164 years before Cook, and made landfall on the 26th of February at the Pennyfather River near the modern town of Weipa on Cape York. In 1623, 145 years before Cook, the Dutch ship Arnhem, commanded by another Willem, Van Colster, he sighted what will become known as Arnhem Land as part of a surveying expedition. The Dutch ship, the Klein Amsterdam, and the vessel, commanded by Peterson, they sailed by Arnhem Land and along Melville Island, noting that there are inhabitants on these places. In 1644, Abel Tasman's expedition from Cape York to Carnarvon also involved encounters with Aboriginal people. In 1650, according to historians, this was the earliest possible date for the Macassan voyages, the start of voyages to Arnhem Land. And throughout the 18th and 19th century, Macassa sailors from Sulawesi, which is now Indonesia, would arrive in Arnhem Land in December each year, departing in April. These fishermen traded with China, supplying up to 1/3 of that country's treepang, sea cucumber, which they gathered and cured on the shores of Arnhem Land. And the last Macassa boat was a prow, that they called them, visited in 1906, or about 1908, not too sure, but it's 1906, 1907. In 1705, there was a Dutch expedition to Arnhem Land and Bathurst Island that was led by a fellow called Martin van Delft in a boat called the Vossenbosch, and Peter Fredericks in a boat called the Nova Hollandia. And there was always also a sloop that was in that little fleet called the Wager. And they charted the whole of the western and northern coastlines and named the island continent New Holland. But they made no attempt to settle on this new continent. William Dampier, an English explorer and privateer, landed on the northwest coast of New Holland in 1688, and again in 1699 when he made a return trip. And then in 1768, the Lords of the British Admiralty signed Lieutenant James Cook's secret instructions to find the, and I quote, Great South Land, and with the consent of the natives, I repeat, with the consent of the natives, to take possession of convenient situations in the country in the name of the King of Great Britain, end quote. And in 1770, Captain James Cook, I'm not sure if he was captain by that stage, he may still have been lieutenant, declares ownership of the east coast of Australia on behalf of Great Britain. Now, you know, you've all heard, I guess, that Britain had earlier signed treaties in North America, and with King George III declaring the initial tenets of treating with North American Aboriginal peoples in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. But something must have gone very much astray in the recognition of the prior rights of Australia's First Nations. At no point did Lieutenant Cook ever offer to treat with the natives or to seek or receive any First Nations consent, nor did the first governor Captain Arthur Phillip. King George III's 1787 instructions put Phillip really in an impossible position. These ordered Phillips to secure, and I quote, "yourself and the people who accompany you as much as possible from any attacks or interruptions of the natives of that country, as well as for the preservation and safety of the public stores, proceed to cultivation of the land." End quote. He was also ordered, they also ordered him to, and I quote again, "endeavour by every possible means to open an intercourse with the original document said savages, and that's, when you look at the original document, the word savages is crossed out and it's substituted by the word natives. But anyway, to open intercourse with the natives and to conciliate their affections, enjoining all our subjects to live in amity and kindness with them. And if any of our subjects shall wantonly destroy them or give them an unnecessary interruption in the exercise of their several occupations, it is our will and pleasure that you do cause such offenders to be brought to punishment according to the degree of the offence." Now, Phillip certainly followed his instructions. He did show amity and kindness. He was genuinely interested in Aboriginal life and customs. He gave many gifts. He even prevented reprisals when he was speared in the shoulder. But early, broadly friendly relations with the Eora and the Darug First Nations soon declined, inevitably into sustained hostility. There was a structural contradiction in the King's instructions and an apparent conflict of interest. The entire British colonial enterprise itself was a sovereign act of aggression, and it couldn't be made good by amity and kindness, nor blankets, beads and tobacco. And Governor Phillip, however well-intentioned, could not both execute his orders and conciliate the affections of the natives. It was a military occupation, enabling the taking of the lands, seas, waters and governance of the lives of First Nations peoples. These acts weren't wanton or unnecessary interruption. They were the necessary conditions for the foundation of the penal colony of New South Wales. So what were the First Nations' several occupations? Well, they were hunting, fishing, food harvesting, mosaic burnings and caring for country, the practice of law and learning, the speaking of language, the fulfilment of sacred and kinship obligations, the observation of rituals of renewal, birth, initiation and burial on the country of their ancestors. All of these occupations were interrupted and ultimately ravaged. The colonisation of Australia deprived First Nations of all that gives material and physical substance to their lives. And the colonisation proceeded incrementally, inexorably, expanding from Sydney Cove. Initially, colonisers thought that the Aboriginal people would simply conveniently depart the stage when faced with the light of the dawn of liberty, civilisation and Christianity. That's a quote. The Right Reverend Bishop Broughton contemplated their end with assurance in his evidence to the House of Commons Select Parliamentary Committee on Aboriginal Tribes on British Settlements at Westminster in 1837. He said they do not so much retire as decay. Wherever Europeans meet with them, they appear to wear out and gradually decay. They diminish in numbers. They appear actually to vanish from the face of the earth. I am led to apprehend that within a very limited period, a few years, those who are most in contact with Europeans will be utterly extinct. I will not say exterminated, but they will be extinct. End quote. Now, the Select Committee concluded that British subjects had wrought damage in less mysterious and more material ways. They said their, meaning First Nations, their claims, whether as sovereign or proprietors of the soil, have been utterly disregarded. The land has been taken from them without the assertion of any other title than superior power, end quote. Sorry, superior force. Now, it used to be somewhat comforting, commonplace of Australian history that apart from deaths caused by a devastating outbreak of smallpox, that Aborigines put up sporadic, treacherous resistance, which was judiciously suppressed before they passively descended into apathy and faded from view. For decades, school history texts reflected this belief, otherwise virtually ignoring the place of First Nations in Australian history. The truth is very different. In official records and eyewitness accounts, we can see that it's very different. Aboriginal people indeed resisted. Aboriginal people never surrendered or ceded sovereignty. And Aboriginal people resisted the very first British landing on Australian soil. As Cook's journal for the 29th of April 1770 describes it. He said in his journal, "Two men seemed to be resolved to oppose our landing. As soon as I saw this, I ordered the boats to lay upon their oars. As soon as we put the boat in, they again came to oppose us, upon which I fired a musket between the two, which had no other effect than to make them retire back, where bundles of their darts lay, and one of them took up a stone and threw it at us, which caused my firing of a second musket load with small shot. And although some of the shots struck the man, yet it had no other effect than to make him lay hold of a shield or a target to defend himself immediately. After this, we landed, which we had no sooner done than they threw 2 darts at us. This obliged me to fire a third shot, soon after which they both made off, but not in such haste, but what we might have taken one. But Mr. Banks, being of the opinion that the darts were poison, made me cautious how I advanced into the woods." Now, Banks' account makes a similar account in his journal, and he said that each of the two men was armed with a lance of about 10 feet long and a short stick, which he seemed to handle as if it was a machine to throw the lance. He's obviously talking about a woman. So, this leads me to talk about truth-telling. And I'd like to use a more embracing, more comprehensive term, which some people call unfinished business. And this means we must revisit the past. And we must be robust about it. Unfinished business and truth-telling. This is how I define it. It's the yet-to-be-met legitimate grievances of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that arises directly from colonisation by the British and the ongoing consequences of that colonisation. It's also about confronting the legacy of the past and realigning the relationship between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations and the peoples and governments of the people of Australia. I mean, the unfinished business clutters the path of Australian history. Truth-telling provides an opportunity in addressing this unfinished business and an opportunity for a genuine renewal of the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians. So what are these truths? What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the human and material impacts of the prior denial of Aboriginal rights that still reverberate in the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. It reverberates in the burden of disease, the rates of incarceration, employment and education, and it's most evident in those areas. And many of these present injustices are the consequences of the past. And until there's reasonable equality in every indicator of well-being, there will always remain unfinished business. And this is a matter simply of social justice. To understand how colonisation and its aftermath can be constructively addressed, we must understand the perspectives of Aboriginal people. We need to speak of the wrongs that many would prefer to forget, including acts that were criminal by the standards of the day, let alone the standards of today. We need to acknowledge not only the recent past, but the injustices present at the founding of our nation. Aboriginal reaction to the arrival of the First Fleet was varied, cautious, curious, friendly and hostile. But when the full implications of the arrival of the British became apparent, the reaction hardened into serious resistance. The British assumed ownership over larger and larger tracts of land and vital water resources. It was an invasion with It was an invasion with permanent intent, with soldiers enforcing de facto control. The legal justification for First Nations dispossession arrived with the invaders, travelling with them in the king's ships, in his instructions and the books of British law. There was no treating with the natives for the use of the land, no negotiation seeking terms of coexistence and common occupation. There was no reciprocity or respect. Consent was never a question. And given that we're in the Northern Territory, there was a little bit of a shift in the pattern of colonisation in the Northern Territory frontier. And the natural protection of the remoteness and size of the territory and relatively small non-Indigenous population and the evolution of the approach to the Aboriginal problem were in fact to some degree a benefit to First Nations of the territory. But in the end, sheer numbers, guns, horses, shackles, diseases, intentional poisoning, together with sugar, tea, tobacco, flour and alcohol, decimated the Aboriginal people of the territory as well. The entire horizon of Aboriginal life, family, kinship, caring for country, knowledge, language, spirituality and culture that sustained and gave meaning and coherence to their existence for millennia was seriously impacted and had devastating consequences. The primary fact is that Aborigines regarded the land as theirs. And this is a quote from one of the settlers. And that the invasion of the white man is a declaration of war. And the result is simply the survival of the fittest. I'm well aware that there are many odious things done by whites, but I believe I express the opinion of 9/10 of those who've taken their lives in their hands and gone into the back blocks when I say that occupation of the country for pastoral purposes and peaceable relations with the native tribes are hopelessly irreconcilable. There is a straight issue presented for the philanthropist, the statesman and the capitalist to consider. Does the land inalienably belong to the Aborigines who have from time immemorial occupied it and exercised tribal rights over it? Legislation on the subject of Aborigines is no doubt absolutely necessary, unless the state intends to assist in exterminating them as soon as possible. Excuse me for a minute. Now that came from J.L. Parsons, who was a government resident in 1889, report on the Northern Territory colony of South Australia. Extermination was never the policy of the British or Australian governments, but they certainly anticipated the gradual withering away of First Nations. with that notion, the withering away notion, was current well into the 20th century. The determination of First Nations' degree of Aboriginality was in those days at the discretion of the Chief Protector. Protectors took Aboriginal children who were deemed half-caste. They took those children to re-education camps, such as the Bungalow, Jay Creek in Central Australia, the Carlin Compound and the Retta Dixon Home in Darwin, and the Bathurst Island, Croker Island, Groot Island missions, all in the top end, and critical parts of the early Commonwealth ordinances continued in force. So folks, in recalling the past, we shouldn't forget that there was always another view of First Nations peoples in this country. Even on the rough country of the Northern Territory frontier, there was considerable coexistence, cooperation, respect and friendship. Later regimes of segregation and assimilation eroded a lot of these earlier relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. But there are threads of deep connection that have always endured. So the better part of our shared history also needs to be told, part of the truth-telling. And we shouldn't forget the odious, the horrible, the atrocious events, particularly massacres. They are clear examples of unfinished business. And it's obviously impossible to ease the pain or make amends to the dead. But squarely facing up to history is the starting point of purposefully laying it to rest. The last official recorded massacre in Australia, officially known as the Coniston Massacre, occurred in 1928, 3 hours these days by motorcar northwest of Alice Springs. A precise number of Aboriginal dead is difficult to ascertain. Estimates range from 17 to 200. The official finding was 31. The Central Land Council estimates there were 100 victims. The massacre involved the sustained hunting and killing of Warlpiri, Unmatjara and Kaiditch people by a party of police and civilians led by Constable George Murray in reprisal for the death of a dingo trapper, Fred Brooks, at Yukurura, or Brooks Soak. Accounts from 1928 said that Brooks was killed for breaching Warlpiri marriage laws, which was a punishable offence under Warlpiri law. 2 Warlpiri men, Arkigra and Patagar, were arrested for his murder. They were acquitted after a criminal trial. A government inquiry exonerated the leaders. Thanks, nearly there. Exonerated the leaders, finding that the actions were self-defence. Well, it's difficult to imagine how, after actively seeking separate family groups over August, September and November of 1928, all the deaths, including those of women and children, could be uniformly resulted from self-defence. The official inquiry found not a scintilla of evidence existed to suggest punitive motivation by whites. That was the nature of justice of the time. Well, the facts perhaps cannot be changed, but our response to them today remains open. So let me finish on this business of truth-telling and how fundamental it is to dealing with unfinished business. In 2018, the 19th memorial anniversary of the massacres at Coniston was commemorated. A witness, Denny Junpa Nolan, obviously now a very elderly and old man, said, "They kept shooting until they ran out of bullets. We heard gunshots and ran to the nearby valleys and hills. We climbed the hills to save our lives. Everyone was running for safety. Every one of them ran away. Even my father and us mob. We scattered. We were all together on the top of the hill, frightened." The Chief Minister, the Honourable Michael Gunner, said that, "I'm sorry for what happened here 90 years ago, and the truth must be told and the truth must be heard." Rhys Kershaw, the Chief Commissioner of Northern Territory Police, laid a wreath and stated there is no excuse or justification for what occurred here 90 years ago. Liza Dale Hallett, great niece of Mounted Constable George Murray, the policeman who led the killers, said, "We are here today because we believe in facing our history." Australia's history. So, Coniston provides a strong territory example of how that might be done. Reparation may take the form of financial payment, like damages in a legal claim for past wrongs, or it may take another material form. That form might be, whatever that form might be, it must fit the notion of forming a new relationship built over the wreckage of the past. Galia, I'm done. Thank you. Happy to take some questions now.
Professor Mick Dodson, I think that speech in itself was an act of truth-telling, coming to terms with our violent history as you describe it. Colonisation is a solemn act of aggression, and you've taken us through the massacres, you've taken us through the mentality of the dying race, which is not a historical mentality. We see it today, and I think this is a really timely seminar because as we come to terms with not only Black Lives Matter in the United States, but First Nations deaths in custody. And I know you're a commissioner in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. And we see the repeated killings of Aboriginal people in custody today. And the premise of many of those deaths being unaccountable. Many of those deaths being regarded as the result of natural causes. That is the mentality of a dying race. And I think we know from your speech and from the commitment to treaties that that's not good enough. And today I think we've really seen part of this process of truth-telling. And indeed, I'm seeing messages on the YouTube chat saying how insightful this contribution of yours is today. And we've also got some questions, and I encourage everyone to keep asking those questions, but I'm wondering whether it would be appropriate now to turn to Kelly who opened today's seminar to ask the first question.
Thank you, Thalia. And thank you so much, Professor Dodson, for that talk. It was very interesting. The question that I would go to is on the nature of truth-telling, and truth-telling in particular about some of those aspects of invasion history, post-colonisation history that Professor Dodson has raised today. How do we, as a country, begin the process of having a formal truth-telling process so that we can start to have a conversation about the past as a way to begin actual reconciliation?
I mean, somebody has to take charge of it, is the simple answer. I think the central responsibility for it is with government. A government has to establish the machinery by which we can engage in a truth-telling process. And the truth-telling process must start as soon as we can start it. We shouldn't have to wait for other events. We can get on with the job now. We can set up the structures to allow truth-telling. The national inquiry into the stolen generations provides a good model that we might be able to adjust and copy and restructure to do the process, some type of national commission or state and territory-based commissions that are part of the process of treaty making. But it has to start soon. Too many old people are dying. We need to get their stories down. There's a discussion paper coming out soon for the Northern Territory Treaty Commission. We deal with this subject of truth-telling and how it might be structured. And we'll be seeking people to give us feedback and submissions. The discussion paper is simply that, a paper for discussion. And we'll be welcoming ideas and comments from anybody who wants to, and not just in the Northern Territory. People from outside the Northern Territory may well want to look at what we're suggesting. But it has to be driven by the government. They ultimately are responsible for what occurred in our history and the impact of ongoing colonisation of Aboriginal people, and part of that is what Thalia alluded to, the 432 deaths in custody since the Royal Commission ended 29 years ago, and the numbers are greater than they were looking at those deaths that the Commission looked at.
Great. I'm going to ask some questions now from the online audience. But I must say I'm really looking forward to, and I'm sure many others are, to seeing that discussion paper. So thank you for announcing that. So the first question comes from Elsie Beale. She asks, what would progress look like to you? What are some strategies you think the government and wider non-Indigenous community could engage in truth-telling to help reconciliation? So I think that's two questions really. Maybe if you can focus on what progress might look like.
Progress to me would be the full embracing of treaty making at a national level. You know, when and a treaty process that allows people to allows Indigenous First Nations peoples to fully enjoy their right to self-determination, and that's on the pathway to dealing with the past. You know, you've got to deal with the. You've got to engage with the past, understand its impact, but also set up structures as to how you're going to deal with it, not just today, but well into the future, generations ahead of us. I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the second question.
Look, we've got 3 more questions, so I might just keep moving through it. Nicola Buller says, what would Professor Dodson recommend regarding the organisation of truth-telling and reconciliation meetings at the community level to discuss unfinished business?
Yeah, I think I sort of answered that question in the first question, but you know, the Bringing Them Home inquiry did was to sit down with communities and talk about that historical experience. Gave people an opportunity to not just to be heard, but also officially at a federal government level institution, the Human Rights Commission, an opportunity to tell their story and have it validated at the highest level. You know. That alone is a devastating issue for Indigenous Australia. It wrecked people's lives. And, you know, the numbers of children out of home care today is far higher than when the Human Rights Commission did the Stolen Generations inquiry. That's just unacceptable. No, it just shouldn't happen. And it's like deaths in custody. You know, I had a journalist talk to me this morning about the deaths in custody, a senior journalist, you know, asking me, oh, what can we do? And I said, what? There are 339 recommendations telling you what to do. They're nearly 30 years old. They've been sitting gathering dust. That's what you should do, dust them off and get them implemented. They're still highly relevant. They haven't aged. We just insist on, at every turn, with public policy, past practice and law, we keep reinventing the wheel. The answers are there. They're in the archives, they're in the libraries, they're in depositories all over the place. There's libraries full of the answers that we choose to just ignore and forget. Truth-telling isn't about forgetting, it's about accounting. It's being accountable together for what happened. And not only being accountable, doing something about it.
Yes. I'm going to ask one final question because the clock is ticking. Karen Stort asks, how do we address the learning of history? We know it's essential to improve the lives of First Peoples. How do we do this not just for the minority of people, but more broadly?
Well, again, the answers in these multiple inquiries, royal commissions, investigations we've had for decades and decades. It tells us how we can change things. All of those reports that are gathering dust tell us. We've got to get on with the job, not waste more money talking about the problem. And then specifically about the stolen generation. You know. We have oodles of evidence, and we had recommendations in that inquiry as well that haven't been fully or adequately implemented. I mean, if the golden principle or the golden thread is that the child placement principle, where you try and place Aboriginal kids who have to be removed from family with other family or keep them within the group, I mean, that's exploded. They're not there. They're out of family care. Why do we keep ignoring these expensive inquiries and then asking questions about, oh, what can we do? We know what to do. We just have to have the courage to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I took heart in what you said about the material conditions needing to change. This isn't only a symbolic gesture. We need to change conditions across all indicators. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much, to wrap it up and to hand it back over to Kelly to say some final words.
Yeah, thank you for being our moderator, Thalia.
Cheers.